Great to be joined today on Selection Sunday by Eric Henry of 24/7 Sports. He's a beat writer for the Texas Longhorns. And the big news of the day here in the Cincinnati area is that the Xavier Musketeers heard their name on Selection Sunday. And we are live here on YouTube. So if you are watching this, make sure you subscribe to the Rebound Rundown's YouTube channel. Plenty more content coming throughout the week as this game approaches on Wednesday night. But just to give people that are listening to this and kind of want to get up to speed on where we are here, Xavier and Texas, part of the first four in Dayton. This game will be played at 9:10 Eastern time on True TV on Wednesday night. Spiro Dedes, Jim Spinarkle, John Rothstein will have the call of that game. It's scheduled for 9:10. There's the 16 seed game at 6:40. So Xavier's game will be about a half hour after that. If anybody has any questions and you're watching in the YouTube chat, please put questions in the chat. We can fly them up on the screen and answer them live. But Eric, I don't want to take too much of your time tonight. I appreciate you joining me here on short notice. First off, let's talk about the Longhorns, because I'm sure there's a lot of people watching this that haven't maybe even seen a second of Texas Longhorn basketball so far this season. Texas 19-15 on the year. They come into this one with obviously some question marks after how they played in the SEC, but some significant wins as well. I think this is a talented team. What's your overall impression of Texas and how they finished up the year?
Yeah, first off, appreciate you having me on. Listen, I am not going to lie to you. It has been a weird and strange 48, 72 hours since I got back from Nashville, Tennessee. Didn't know if I'd be having this conversation with you, even up until 10, 15 minutes into the selection show. When I saw North Carolina get selected in that first four, myself and some of the other members of the Texas media contingency thought, all right, well, the Longhorns bubble just burst. Little did we know, they made fools out of us, right? About 5 minutes later, we heard Texas, and it was stunned, quite frankly. The reason kind of for that surprise, for those of you, most of your audience, I assume, hasn't seen a lot of Texas play this year, the best way I can describe the Longhorns, and I don't say this to be funny, it's just the best way I've been able to describe this team this year. If you could imagine an AAU team that didn't practice, that's what you're talking about with the Texas Longhorns, okay? An incredible collection of talent that at times have looked like they have never met each other, let alone dribbled a ball on a court with each other in practice. I'll just kind of run down the list. I won't try to take up too much time, but I'll run down the list.
No, absolutely. Take as much time as you want.
Yeah, sure. So, you took a look at this team in non-conference play. I believe Ken Pom has them ranked like 352nd or 353 out of 366 Division I teams in non-conference play. Their schedule was not tough leading up to the SEC. There's no two ways about it. And the few matchups that were of really any significance, they lost, right? The only one they had that was a real win, they beat NC State, but they lost to Ohio State, lost to UConn. It just was like, all right, but what is this team going to be? They have a superstar in Trey Johnson, and he looked phenomenal against the University of New Orleans of the world and the Arkansas Pine Bluffs of the world. But what do you have in this team when they get to SEC play? Well, they stumbled out of the gate, quite frankly. Things did not look good. It was the second straight year that Texas struggled out of the gate in conference play. And in large part, Paul, the thing is this, right? This is the second straight year that Texas had to portal a lot of their roster, right? Let's just run down the names. You talk about a few of them. Arthur Kaluma, who came in from Kansas State, always with Creighton prior. Julian Larry and Jason Kent, two guys who started for Indiana State in their NIT run last year. They've been reserves for Texas this year. Tremont Mark, who was Arkansas's leading scorer last year, he came out of fall camp. I've got football on the mind. Let's try this again. Came out of training camp. For folks, I cover both football and basketball, so forgive me on that. Came out of training camp with a groin injury, so he missed the first 5-6 games of the year. It was kind of a challenge to get him integrated into the system. And then Jordan Pope, kind of a scoring guard at Oregon State, their leading scorer, trying to get him integrated in alongside Trey Johnson and Caden Shedrick and some of the others. So it took time. Then they kind of had a little stretch where they, won a few games in SEC play. And, after they beat up on LSU, who, hasn't been a good team this year, you're thinking, all right, maybe they're hitting their stride. But this is a team that lost 7 of their last 9 regular season games. And Paul, it got embarrassing, being at home. You're losing to old school rivals like Arkansas, where they're doing the pig suey chant, running Texas fans out of Moody Center. You're losing to Oklahoma. They're doing the Boomer Sooner chant, running Texas fans out of Moody Center, right? Outside of a win against Kentucky, where Kentucky was banged up a little bit, and a win against A&M, which was a solid win. Texas really struggled down the stretch in Southeastern Conference play. So you got to the SEC tournament and you're wondering, okay, what is the team going to give you, right? Well, here's one thing. They got healthy, okay? Arthur Kaluma was banged up with a knee. He gutted out a win over Missouri, a game that, quite frankly, he probably shouldn't have finished because that knee ended up being a lingering thing all year. As I mentioned, Tremont Mark was in and out of the lineup with a knee, a groin, back spasms. Kendall Weaver, a name that most of your audience probably isn't familiar with, talking about a 6'3" guard who is one of the better rebounding guards in all the SEC, averaged over 5 boards a game, but he missed 15 games with a left hip flexor injury. All those guys came back and were healthy, and this team, quite frankly, looked like the team that Rodney Terry, I think, envisioned it would be when he built it. That Trey Johnson, the SEC's leading scorer, averages just under 20 points per game, is capable of giving you 30 and 40 a night, or, on any given night, I should say, but that they would have some veteran presence, some secondary scorers. It's taken 31 games, quite frankly, because of the injuries and kind of the ill fit of some of these guys to kind of make this thing work. But they won 2 in Nashville, and that clearly was enough to get them in the NCAA tournament.
So you brought up a few names there, and for Xavier fans listening to this, there are going to be 3 names that are familiar. One in particular, and then 2, if you followed Indiana State last year, there are 2, as you said, Indiana State players that played with Ryan Conwell on last year's Indiana State team that got snubbed. And it was interesting. I just came from Xavier's press conference after they announced the bracket, and asking Ryan what it was like now to be on the right side of the bubble as opposed to the wrong side of the bubble last year. It was just interesting hearing his reaction to it and everything that they went through last year. And now, you see Julian Larry and Jason Kent now being in the last 4 in, right? And getting that chance to play in the tournament, but also a name that Xavier fans might remember, Arthur Kaluma, who didn't go straight to Texas from Creighton, but a familiar Big East name from a couple of years ago, transferred to Kansas State and then ended up at Texas. You mentioned Kaluma a little bit, but since that's somebody that people could latch on to here, how has Kaluma's season been? Has he been, what Xavier fans might remember of him, or what's been your impression of him in his first year at Texas?
Yeah, when I mentioned kind of the ill fit of the roster, and I'm going to get to Art in a second, I think a large part of that was because you had taken guys, again, like Tremont Mark, like Jordan Pope, who they were their team's primary scorers last year. And essentially they need to be secondary guys, right? Guys who maybe you're not getting 12, 13, 15 shots a game. Maybe you're getting, 6, 7, 8, and you got to make the most of what to do with those. Julian Larry and Jason Kent were starters in Indiana State. All the guys I've mentioned are getting less minutes, less shots, etc. The one guy who is fit from day one is Arthur Kaluma. And I think the reason for that is because at Kansas State, and even prior at Creighton, he was never asked to be the guy, right? He was always a second guy or a third guy, right? So Arthur's come in and it's fit really well. He's been this team's leading rebounder. I think he's just a notch under 8 boards per game, but for the most part, it's been a double-double threat. He's been their best big, and that's no disrespect to Caden Shedrick, who for the first time in his career played every single game. He's been injured most of his career, was with Virginia prior before joining Texas last year. But Caden at 6'11" isn't the strongest or most consistent rebounder. He's a more of a rim protector, a guy who can step out and shoot a little bit, but it isn't going to be that guy who's going to give you 10 boards. It's fallen on Art as an undersized 4, 6'6", 6'7", 220 to be that guy. And it's worked great. I mean, he's done the dirty work, been a very consistent defender, as I mentioned, great on the glass, as a scorer. When Trey was carrying the load in SEC play, and they just were looking for anyone to kind of be a consistent double-digit scorer, it wasn't Jordan Pope, who averaged 17 a night last year. It wasn't Tremont Mark, who averaged 16 a night last year. It was Arthur Kaluma, who was at least giving you 10, 12, 15 a night. So he's been, of all the transfer pieces, he's been the player that's fit the best with this group.
It's interesting to hear you say that. And one other guy I want to ask about, because for me, when I would turn Texas on this year, especially down the stretch when they became more into the bubble conversation and you're following the bubble and who's going to get in, who's going to get all of that, and you add Texas to the list and you start to watch more of Texas down the stretch. I've just been so impressed with Trey Johnson as a freshman to be able to do what he's done, to score the way he has scored this year. So talented and a bright future for him. What has been maybe his biggest success? What has made him so successful this year?
I hate to steal a cliche from Rodney Terry, because trust me, God knows there are plenty of cliches from Rodney Terry, but he's a 3-level scorer. It's the truth. He can score inside, can score outside. He's got a mid-range game. And the thing about him is just his maturity is well beyond his 18 years. I mean, Trey is always intense. He just is. I don't mean that in a negative, I mean as a positive. It's kind of that Kobe cycle factor, right? Like, he is always intense. If you get Trey and you ask him, open availability, Trey, you got a minute? He gets that look on his face like he's trying to drive to the hoop. He's like, yeah, let's go. Like, Trey is just, a super intense competitor. And I think that, in conjunction with his maturity, has helped him make the transition from the high school game to the college game so well, in addition to the cliche that I gave you, is he can just score. He's a walking bucket. When Trey gets hot and gets going, he can shoot it from anywhere. It's been more or less, he's had to take, I'll put you this way. If I had to give you one thing that has been a knock on Trey, I think it's because of the fact that they have had to lean on him so much. There have been moments in the second halves of games where, 1 or 2 games this year, I think it's 2, if memory serves me correct, where Trey didn't put up a shot in the second half, right? Where Trey's trying to get other guys involved. And I think part of that's because Rodney Terry's asking him, later on, as it became apparent that they really needed him to kind of do a little bit of everything, to, hey, maybe, initiate the offense and maybe use your skill set to get other guys involved more. So that's been a little bit of a knock. Sometimes, the shooting goes a little awry, but that's not because of a lack of ability. I think it's, mainly because, all right, if I got to shoot 25, 30 times a night, eventually, the shots, you might not hit a few. But to answer your question, Trey's just been a consistent scorer all the way through. His maturity makes him good, makes him great.
So if I tell you to just kind of set the stage for this Xavier team this year that has a very talented backcourt, for a lot of the season, they relied on their starting group. They weren't getting a ton of bench production, but as the season's gone on, they've got more and more production. Zach Fremantle, one of the most talented post scorers in the Big East, not a huge threat defensively inside from anybody for Xavier, but they've been able to piece it together very well as the season's gone on. The defense has greatly improved. In fact, what I would tell you, Eric, is coming into the season, we thought that this was going to be a Xavier team that you'd have to score 100 to beat every night when you played them. We thought that this was going to be a 90 to 85 type of team every time you went out and played, and it hasn't turned into that, mostly because it's taken a while for a lot of these transfers to gel. But as the season's gone on, we saw Ryan Conwell, an all Big East performer in the Big East tournament, 38 points for him, the most ever by a Xavier player in a Big East tournament game. Zach Fremantle has been healthy. The bench has started to give Xavier more. When you look at the backcourt, and I know it's 2 hours after the bracket has been announced, so I'm not asking you to get into the weeds of all of this, but just in general, when I tell you that Xavier has a very talented backcourt with a front court that can score and stretch the floor just in enough instances where they need to, how does that just initially sound to you as far as a matchup perspective?
Okay. When you talk about challenging Texas, I think the best way to challenge the Horns is having a strong front court. Okay. Because as I mentioned, Caden Shedrick, a solid rim protector, but he's not overall a great defender. He's a good defender. Again, play for Tony Bennett, Virginia. You got to play a little defense, right? He's solid, but I wouldn't call him great. Arthur, again, is a little bit undersized. That's where teams look no further than South Carolina game, for example, where Colin Murray Boyles, one of the top, post players, right? Forwards in the nation, wins the game for South Carolina. They were in last place in the SEC. So in terms of what you just laid out, it sounds like it's a 50-50 type of ball game, because I would think, especially with this team has Tremont Mark more or less healthy, Kendall Weaver, again, can't say that name enough. For any of your listeners, watchers who are not familiar with Kendall Weaver, do a little deep dive. I mean, more kind of a junkyard dog mentality. That's how he describes his game. He's super athletic, probably the team's best perimeter defender, and he just gets rebounds. It's a natural instinct for that. So I think especially with Mark and Weaver healthier, I think that bodes a little bit in Texas's favor as far as defending a capable backcourt. But yeah, if Xavier could put together something in the front court, that, if I were looking from a Xavier fan's perspective, that would intrigue me a lot. Okay,
2 more questions and I'll let you go. I don't want to keep you on here too long, but I have the question, because I know this is something that's been circling around for a while. Rodney Terry now in effectively his 3rd season but 2nd season full-time, but there have been a lot of question marks about Rodney Terry, and what would happen if Texas did or didn't make the tournament this year or anything like that. What do you think has been maybe the biggest frustration? You talk about a Texas team that feels like they're an AAU team, right? That has a ton of talent, but maybe doesn't put it all together all that well. What have been your impressions of the coaching? And I'm not asking you to put anybody on the spot or anything like that, but just what have it been your impressions of this coaching staff this year and some of the questions surrounding it?
It all depends on what side of the coin you want to look at it, right? Let's start, as I mentioned, this team, in terms of injuries, they've only had their full complement of guys, their roster, for 4 games this year, right? 4 out of 34. So you do the math there. Trey Johnson missed 2 games in non-conference. Mark, as I mentioned, missed games. Weaver, Kaluma's missed games, et cetera. Jason Kent had a wrist injury. So that's one side of it. Another side of it is the fact that, at least in the aspect of if you want to make the case in Rodney Terry's defense, is, and I've reported this, Texas's NIL spending isn't what you would think it would be, right? They're about middle of the pack in the SEC. And I'm of the firm belief that, okay, if the standard, and that's what Texas AD Chris Del Conte has said, is I want to compete for national titles in every sport, well, you got to find a way to get some of those, money folks, and there's plenty of folks here in Texas do have money to open those pockets, right? The flip side of that is, I think some of those folks who would donate money would feel different if they had a different coach. And you just look at it 2 years in a row. Last year, Texas, yes, the roster was a bit ill-fitted. They didn't get Ron Holland because he went to the G League, right? So maybe you can give RT a bit of a mulligan there. But this year, again, to be on the bubble with arguably the top freshman talent to come through the 40 acres since Kevin Durant, that was frustrating for a lot of folks. The fact that, like I said, night in, night out, you didn't know what you were going to get, getting blown out by rivals at home, losing to a South Carolina. Sometimes where the offense just looks like it's iso ball. It's just Trey and everyone else, maybe it's your day, maybe it's not, right? This is a veteran coaching staff. Like, I have a lot of respect for Frank Haith, Steve McLean, Byron Jones, et cetera. Veteran coaching staff. But it's been, and then Chris Ogden as well, the GM, as kind of the roster constructor of the constructor of this roster, I should say. That would be the flip side. I would look at this and say, all right, well, we know the trajectory that seemingly the program was on with Chris Beard and made it to an Elite 8, and now it's kind of trending downwards. So when you ask about Rodney Terry, and I've written this, that I think that, hey, if Chris Del Conte chooses to go another direction, and we have reason to believe that that was something that they may be exploring, it's going to be a matter of what's the priority here at Texas? Is it making NCAA tournaments? Because if that's the case, then Rodney Terry's the man for this job. If it's competing for a national title, then okay, maybe you can provide some credence and say, all right, we want to go get a Sean Miller, Bill Self, Grant McCaslin, et cetera, right? So I think it all depends on the lens that you view that from.
Gotcha. Any final thoughts here before we wrap this up going forward toward Wednesday night with Xavier and Texas?
Yeah, I'll just be quick. I mean, two things. One, take a look at how Texas starts. If they start poorly, it's been very tough for them to kind of dig themselves out of a hole. Those first 4 minutes, teams have been able to beat Texas more or less in the first 4 to 8 minutes of games, right? If you can be physical with Texas, look at the Texas A&M game, the first game in Reed Arena at College Station as an example. You take it to Texas physically early on, whether it's first half or coming out of the intermission in the second half, you can beat this team. So that's one thing I would look for from a Xavier fan's perspective. For Texas, if you're a Texas fan, just this roster, they look much more confident. When we spoke with the guys, just leaving Moody Center, they all say, like, man, because everyone's healthy, we finally feel like this is the team that we thought we were signing up for, and how much confidence the 2 wins in Nashville gave them. It's like, all right, no, what we thought we had at the beginning of the year is actually real. So if this team starts fast and they get confident, they can shoot the lights out. And that's the thing for Texas fans you got to really keep an eye on.
Eric, I really appreciate it. Where can people, if they want to follow up, read more of your stuff through the week leading up to this game, where can people follow you and find your stuff?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter or X at EricCHenry_. Find my Texas football and basketball coverage at horns247.com on X, and horns247 on X, and online at horns247.com and 247sports.com.
Eric, I appreciate it. For everybody watching right now, make sure you go down and hit that subscribe button. I'm going to have plenty more preview coverage throughout the week leading up to this game. So make sure you subscribe to the Rebound Rundown on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe on all the audio platforms. Plenty of coverage throughout this week. Eric, thanks so much. Talk to you soon.
No problem.